AITA for telling my sister she can't move in with me after getting pregnant? Growing up in a small, close-knit family, I learned early on that we were meant to rely on each other. Family loyalty was an unspoken rule in our house, almost a tradition, passed down as the one constant expectation we had of each other. My parents, who weren't wealthy and had faced their fair share of struggles, taught my sister and me that, no matter what, family came first. My younger sister and I, despite our 6-year age difference, were raised with the belief that we'd always have each other's backs, no matter the circumstances. Being the eldest, I quickly fell into a protector role with her. As I grew up, I learned to balance my own responsibilities while looking out for her whenever she needed guidance. Whether it was helping her with schoolwork or listening to her vent about her relationships, I always felt a duty to support her and protect her. Even when we had our differences, our bond wasn't perfect, but it was solid, built on those early years of helping each other through every challenge. For her, I was the one she could always come to. And for me, she was my responsibility, my family. Now, as adults, our lives are very different. At 28, I've finally managed to build a stable, independent life, something I've worked tirelessly for. I live in a modest but comfortable one-bedroom apartment, work from home in a job I've put years into, and cherish the stability I've created. After years of hustling through odd jobs, late nights studying, and slowly piecing my life together, I value my space and the routine I've established. For the first time, I feel like I'm in a place where I can breathe, focus on my goals, and make decisions for myself. Then came my sister's recent news, which turned all those feelings of stability upside down. She's now 22 and just announced she's pregnant. The situation with her ex-boyfriend is difficult. He left as soon as she told him about the baby, leaving her to navigate everything alone. She tried moving back in with our parents, but they quickly laid out their expectations. She'd need a plan, a job, and a stable foundation if she wanted to stay. She found their response overwhelming and felt like they weren't offering the support she needed. She wanted unconditional acceptance, while my parents were pushing her toward self-reliance. That's where I come in. Feeling judged and pressured at home, she turned to me, hoping I'd be a solution. A place where she could have space to sort things out and get away from our parents' demands. She saw my stable, quiet apartment as an escape, somewhere she could find the supportive environment she felt she was lacking. When she asked if she could move in, I knew she saw me as the safe, dependable older brother who'd step up without hesitation. But her request weighed heavily on me. I understood why she needed support, but I also had my own responsibilities and limits. The life I've built didn't include room for a baby or the upheaval that would come with having a newborn in a one-bedroom apartment. And while I want to be there for her, the thought of sacrificing my stability and quiet for an indefinite period didn't sit right with me. Our parents expected me to fill the gap, but I knew that helping her wasn't as simple as just opening my door. When my sister told me she was pregnant, I could see the worry in her eyes. She was scared and feeling completely unprepared for what lay ahead. Her ex-boyfriend left the moment he found out, making it painfully clear he wanted no part in raising a child. I can only imagine how devastating it was for her to face that kind of rejection, abandoned at her most vulnerable. Left with the realization that she'd had to tackle everything on her own. She moved back in with our parents as soon as the breakup happened. I think she hoped they would make things easy for her, that they'd offer the reassurance and support she craved. But my parents, while compassionate, are also practical. From the beginning, they made it clear she would need a plan. They expected her to find a job and think through the reality of becoming a single mother. My parents aren't wealthy, and while they're willing to help, they have limits, financially and emotionally. They've always believed in teaching us to be responsible for ourselves, and that didn't change with her situation. To my sister, though, their response felt like a betrayal. She had pictured an outpouring of sympathy, the kind that would allow her to feel cared for, unconditionally, while she figured things out. Instead, my parents' expectations weighed heavily on her. They weren't being cruel, but they saw the future through a lens of practicality. My sister saw it as criticism, a lack of understanding, and she felt trapped. She began to resent the questions they asked about job prospects, finances, and future plans. In her mind, they were judging her, unable to see how overwhelming her circumstances already were. Her frustration with them quickly grew, turning into outright conflict. She would vent to me about how she felt they weren't supporting her in the ways she needed. That they were pushing her to take on responsibilities she wasn't prepared for. She wanted them to understand her need for reassurance. Not pressure. But from what she told me, our parents were trying to help her face the reality of what was coming. Something that required more than just emotional support. The clash between what she wanted and what they expected drove a wedge between them, leaving her feeling isolated and misunderstood. That's when she turned to me, hoping I'd offer the escape she so desperately wanted. She asked if she could move into my apartment, explaining that she needed space and a supportive environment, something she felt she couldn't get with our parents. To her, I think my place symbolized freedom from judgment, a space where she could feel comfortable and focus on herself and the baby without the constant reminders of everything she was supposed to be doing. But what she didn't seem to consider was that my life has its own set of demands and limitations. I live alone in a small, one-bedroom apartment, and I work from home in a role that requires focus and calm. I've built a life centered on stability, where I control my environment to ensure that I can meet my responsibilities. Having her and a newborn in my space would completely shift that balance. I felt torn. I wanted to be there for her in the way she needed. But the reality of sharing my space with her and a baby was overwhelming. I knew that agreeing to this request would mean sacrificing my hard-earned peace. That it would throw my work and my personal life into chaos. And yet, the thought of refusing made me feel guilty, as if I were somehow failing her when she needed me most. The pressure to live up to my role as the responsible, older sibling weighed heavily, pulling me in two directions. As I mulled over her request, I found myself questioning how far family loyalty should go, especially when the cost felt so high. She saw my apartment as a haven, a place where she could escape the pressure at home. But for me, it represented a fragile stability that I wasn't sure I could afford to disrupt. When my sister first asked if she could move in, I was caught off guard. I'd always been the person she leaned on, so I shouldn't have been surprised. But this wasn't like helping her with homework or giving her advice about relationships. This was a monumental shift that would affect every aspect of my life. She explained that she couldn't handle the stress of living with our parents anymore. The tension, the judgment, and their constant reminders of what she should be doing were pushing her to a breaking point. She told me she needed a break, a chance to catch her breath and figure things out without feeling cornered. I could hear the desperation in her voice. She wanted my place to be a safe space, free from judgment and expectation. She told me it would be, just for a little while. But I knew enough to recognize that there was no easy timeline for this situation. Babies are unpredictable, and adjusting to single motherhood takes time. When she said she needed, just a little while, it sounded like a hopeful estimate more than a firm plan. As she sat there waiting for my answer, I could feel a battle beginning to take shape within me. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to fulfill that role of dependable older brother who always comes through. I knew how much she was struggling, and the idea of giving her some peace was tempting. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore the practicalities, the limitations of my space, my need for a quiet environment to work, and, frankly, my desire to keep the life I'd worked so hard to build intact. My apartment is small. It's perfect for one person, maybe two if you're lucky. It's a one-bedroom setup, and every inch of space has been carefully arranged to serve a purpose. I work from home, which means my living room doubles as my office. And quiet isn't just a luxury, it's a necessity. Having my sister, let alone a newborn, in that space would turn everything upside down. My apartment isn't equipped for a baby, and I didn't have the resources or energy to make it baby-friendly overnight. But it wasn't just about space and work. It was about the stability I'd spent years building for myself. This was my first real home, a place where I had control over my environment and my schedule, where I could focus on my work without distractions. That stability was hard-earned, a product of late nights, sacrifices, and choices made in the name of independence. Allowing her and a baby to move in would mean giving up that sense of control. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Still, as she looked at me with hopeful eyes, I felt a pang of guilt for even considering saying no. I knew she had nowhere else to go, and that saying yes would mean the world to her. But the reality of the situation loomed large. I tried to explain to her that it wasn't a simple decision, that I had to think about my work and my own mental well-being. She listened, but I could tell she didn't fully understand. To her, I was her older brother, the person who had always been there to catch her when she fell. She didn't see the weight of what she was asking or how it would impact my day-to-day life. At the same time, I knew that denying her request would feel like a betrayal. I'd been raised to put family first, to step up when they needed me. But this wasn't a small favor. It was a long-term, life-altering commitment. I wanted to help her, but I couldn't ignore the cost to myself. The thought of turning her away filled me with dread, but the idea of saying yes filled me with an equally overwhelming sense of apprehension. As she left that day, the decision hung over me like a cloud. I knew she was counting on me, but I also knew that if I agreed, I'd be putting my own stability on the line. The question remained, could I really give up my carefully built life to help her through this? Or would saying no mean I was failing her, and myself, in some fundamental way? When my sister returned the next day to hear my decision, I could tell she was expecting me to say yes. Her expression was hopeful, her shoulders slightly relaxed, like she was already ready to start moving her things in. But I knew what I had to say, even though it felt like a knot was tightening in my chest. I looked her in the eyes and gently told her no, that as much as I wanted to help, I just couldn't give up my space and stability. I explained that my apartment was too small, my job too demanding, and that I wasn't equipped to handle the demands of a newborn in such close quarters. As the words left my mouth, her face fell, and the hope in her eyes turned into shock, then anger. She couldn't believe I was turning her down. Her reaction was immediate and fierce. She accused me of abandoning her and the baby, saying that I was selfish, that I cared more about my precious job than my family. I tried to explain again, to make her see that it wasn't about not wanting to help, but about my own limitations. But she wasn't listening. She kept throwing accusations, each one hitting a little harder than the last. Her words stung, especially because they touched on some deep-seated fears of mine. I'd always prided myself on being the responsible one, the sibling who had his life together, who could be counted on in times of need. Hearing her call me selfish made me question whether I was failing her in a way that went beyond just this one decision. Was I letting her down when she needed me most? Was I putting my own comfort above the values we'd been raised with? Her words made me doubt myself, even as I held firm to my decision. When she finally stormed out, I sat there, stunned, feeling the weight of what had just happened. I knew I'd hurt her, and the guilt was overwhelming. I could practically hear the voices of my parents in my head, asking me how I could turn away my own sister, how I could be so focused on my own life that I'd ignore her struggles. And deep down, I wondered if they were right. But as much as I wanted to undo the hurt I'd caused, I also knew that agreeing to her request would mean sacrificing my own peace and stability. The fallout didn't end with her departure. My parents soon got involved, calling to tell me how disappointed they were, how they'd expected me to step up as the older sibling. They reminded me that I was the one with a stable job and my own place, that I was in the best position to help her. To them, my decision was a betrayal of family loyalty, a sign that I was more concerned with my independence than the well-being of my own flesh and blood. They called it a temporary solution, a small sacrifice for the sake of family. But I knew it wasn't as simple as that. Babies don't come with a timeline, and the reality of living with her and a newborn would be far from temporary. Despite their words, I held my ground. Though each call and message chipped away at my resolve, I was left questioning myself constantly, wondering if I was truly being selfish, if I was somehow failing as a brother. But each time I thought about saying yes, I felt that same sense of dread, of losing the stability and independence I'd worked so hard to build. In the days that followed, I felt isolated, both from my family and from the certainty I'd once had in my decision. My parents made it clear that they thought I was wrong, and my sister stopped speaking to me entirely. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things I wished I could explain, all the ways I wanted to make her understand. But I knew that, in her eyes, my decision would always be a betrayal, a sign that I'd put myself before her and the baby. As the guilt settled in, I began to wonder if I'd made the right choice at all. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd let her down, that I'd failed to live up to the values we'd been raised with. But I also knew that saying yes would mean sacrificing a part of myself that I wasn't ready to give up. In the end, I was left to grapple with the consequences of my choice, unsure if I'd protected my own boundaries or simply abandoned my family when they needed me most. In the days that followed, I couldn't escape the guilt that seemed to shadow my every thought. My decision hung over me, each memory of my sister's angry words replaying in my mind, questioning whether I'd really made the right choice. The disappointment from my parents added to the weight, making me feel like I'd let everyone down, that I'd somehow betrayed the unspoken promise of family loyalty. I started to second-guess everything. Had I really been selfish? Was I so focused on my own life that I couldn't make room for my sister in her time of need? Growing up, I'd been taught that family was supposed to be there through thick and thin. It was one of the few values my parents had drilled into us. When life gets hard, family steps in, and here I was, the older sibling, the one who had his life together, saying no when it mattered most. The guilt gnawed at me, making me question whether I was as independent and secure as I liked to think, or just unwilling to share that security. I kept replaying my sister's words, especially the ones that stung the most. She'd called me privileged for having my own place and the freedom to say no. That accusation hit a nerve because, in some ways, she wasn't wrong. I had spent years building a life that was my own, a life that allowed me to enjoy the peace of a stable job and a quiet home. But in her eyes, my comfort was a luxury I was choosing over her well-being. I started wondering if my desire for peace and stability was worth this fallout, this painful divide that had opened between us. But at the same time, I knew there was more to it. It wasn't just about my precious job or my comfortable apartment. It was about boundaries, about maintaining the life I'd built after years of struggle and hard work. Saying yes to her request would mean giving up the sense of control I had worked so hard to achieve. I'd spent years trying to prove I could stand on my own, that I didn't have to rely on anyone else to feel secure. Now, it felt like I was being asked to undo all that progress, to let go of that stability for something that felt uncertain and overwhelming. There were times when I thought maybe I should just give in. Just call her up and tell her I changed my mind. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe I could make amends and help her put this behind us. But each time I considered it, the image of a newborn crying through the night, the clutter of baby items filling my small apartment, and the constant disruption to my work-life balance all flooded back. As much as I wanted to help her, I couldn't ignore how much it would change my life. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging doubt. Was I letting my own comfort get in the way of doing the right thing? Was I putting my need for stability above my family's needs? Breaking some unspoken rule that family always comes first? Every call from my parents reminded me of that expectation, and every moment of silence from my sister left me feeling like I'd made a choice that might cost me our relationship. I tried rationalizing it by telling myself I was setting a necessary boundary, that I had the right to say no when something felt too overwhelming. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a simple boundary. It was a line I'd drawn that my family didn't understand and couldn't accept. In their eyes, boundaries didn't apply when family was in need. To them, I was supposed to sacrifice, just as they had, and the fact that I hadn't was the ultimate betrayal. The guilt kept me awake at night, leaving me to wrestle with questions I couldn't easily answer. Had I protected my own needs? Or had I turned my back on the people who raised me? Was this decision a reflection of my independence, or just a sign that I'd become too focused on myself? The doubt and guilt weighed heavily, creating an internal struggle that I couldn't seem to escape. And with each passing day, I was left wondering whether I'd really done the right thing, or if I'd let my sister down in a way that could never be undone. As the guilt and doubt over my decision churned inside me, I tried to remind myself of why I'd chosen to say no. My work wasn't just a job, it was the backbone of the life I'd built. Being a freelancer means that my home is my office, and I rely on a structured, quiet environment to stay focused and productive. The delicate balance I've crafted between work and personal life requires that my space stays as it is, calm, predictable, and undisturbed. Disruptions, even small ones, can throw off my whole routine. And a newborn, no matter how much I love my sister, wasn't just a small disruption. The truth is, freelancing can be incredibly rewarding but equally precarious. Every project, every client interaction demands my full attention, and any prolonged distraction could impact my ability to deliver. Unlike a traditional job, I don't have set hours or a consistent paycheck. Instead, my income depends entirely on my ability to manage my time and meet client expectations without fail. If I mess up, if I miss a deadline or deliver subpar work, I risk losing clients who might never come back. It's a stressful line of work. But it's also something I'm proud of. Something that represents years of effort and dedication. When I envisioned what my life might look like with my sister and her newborn sharing my space, I couldn't ignore the impact it would have on my work. Babies bring with them a whirlwind of sleepless nights, noise, and unpredictability. I could easily picture the crying, the interruptions, the clutter, and while all of that is completely normal for a baby, it's also a reality that would make it impossible for me to maintain my focus and productivity. More than just the physical space, my emotional and mental stability is tied to my work. Freelancing is stressful in its own way, and the pressure to be both breadwinner and self-manager can be exhausting. I developed routines, habits, and boundaries that kept me centered and allowed me to manage the unique stresses of my job. Having a newborn in the same space would add a constant layer of anxiety. One I wasn't sure I could handle without jeopardizing my work or my well-being. The life I'd built had structure and predictability, two things that would be entirely upended by the demands of a baby. And then there's the financial aspect. Freelancing doesn't come with benefits or paid time off. And if I lost productivity, I'd lose income. It's as simple as that. Every hour I spend working has to count. And every hour I lose costs me money. My sister's presence, and the time and energy that caring for her and her baby would require, would directly interfere with my ability to earn. I wouldn't just be risking my comfort, I'd be putting my livelihood on the line. I tried to imagine a compromise. A way to make it work without completely upending my life. Maybe I could reduce my workload or adjust my hours. But the reality of freelancing means that adjusting hours and workload comes with a financial hit. One that I couldn't afford long-term. The idea of having to choose between my family's expectations and my own financial stability left me feeling trapped. Like there was no way to balance the two without sacrificing something important. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I wasn't just saying no to my sister's request. I was saying yes to protecting the stability I'd worked so hard to build. I knew my family might never understand that choice, that they saw my refusal as prioritizing myself over my sister's need. But to me, this wasn't about selfishness, it was about survival. About preserving the life and career I'd poured everything into. For all the guilt and self-doubt I was wrestling with, I couldn't ignore the fact that saying yes would mean undoing years of work and risking the foundation I'd built for myself. In the end, freelancing is more than just my job, it's my independence. It's the life I carved out on my own terms. A life that demands careful management and boundaries. I couldn't abandon those boundaries. Not even for family. That choice didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. But it did help me see that saying no wasn't about failing my sister. It was about staying true to the commitment I'd made to myself. To the stability I'd worked so hard to achieve. Feeling weighed down by guilt and second-guessing my choice, I turned to a few close friends for perspective. I hoped they could see the situation more clearly than I could. Or at least help me sort through my emotions. I explained the circumstances, the small apartment, my freelancing work, my need for stability, and my sister's request. I didn't hold back on the guilt I felt or the tension building between me and my family. I wanted honest feedback, even if it meant hearing that I'd made the wrong decision. Most of my friends were sympathetic. They understood the pressures of freelancing and the need for a calm, uninterrupted space to stay productive. They reminded me of how long I'd worked to create my stable life. The sacrifices I'd made to get here. One friend, a fellow freelancer, pointed out that a single disruption can spiral into lost income and reputation, something she'd experienced firsthand. She said my choice wasn't just about keeping my apartment quiet, it was about preserving the foundation I'd built for my future. But not all of them saw it so simply. A few questioned whether family loyalty should come above my personal boundaries. Even if it was difficult. One friend said, maybe this is the time to sacrifice some comfort for family. It's not forever. And your sister clearly needs someone. Her words struck a chord. And I couldn't dismiss them. Was I clinging to my own life so tightly that I couldn't make room for someone else's crisis? Was my idea of stability so fragile that it couldn't bend, even temporarily, for my sister? I wrestled with that question, turning it over in my mind. Family had always been important to me. And hearing that from my friend made me question whether I was upholding the very values I'd always claimed to prioritize. I thought about my parents and their sacrifices. The countless times they'd put aside their own needs for me and my sister. I wondered if my commitment to independence was just a shield I was using to avoid uncomfortable obligations. Was I setting boundaries, or was I simply avoiding the chaos that my sister's life would bring into mine? But as I weighed these thoughts, I kept coming back to a feeling I couldn't shake, that by saying yes, I'd be setting myself up for an indefinite disruption. The temporary aspect of her request felt uncertain, and knowing my sister, I doubted she had a concrete plan for when or how she'd move on. I could easily imagine this situation dragging on for months, with me sacrificing more and more of my life until I had little of it left. My friend's input helped me see both sides, but I still couldn't ignore that underlying fear of losing the life I'd built. After talking it out, I spent some time alone, reflecting on what boundaries really meant to me. I thought about how hard I'd worked to establish a life where I could be self-sufficient and secure. That wasn't just about my apartment or my freelancing schedule, it was about finally reaching a point where I could put myself first. I'd spent years caring for my sister in small ways, supporting her as she grew up, always feeling like her safety net. And now, it felt like she was asking for the one part of my life I wasn't willing to share, my peace. It wasn't easy to reach a conclusion. The guilt still lingered, and I knew my family would likely never understand why I'd set this boundary. But I realized that holding my ground didn't make me selfish, it made me committed to the life I'd worked to create. My friends had helped me see that boundaries aren't just walls to keep people out, they're choices to protect what matters. And for me, my stability was what mattered most. In the end, my reflections didn't erase the guilt, but they did help me accept that my decision was rooted in self-respect, not abandonment. I would always love my sister and be there for her in the ways I could. But sacrificing my life, my peace, wasn't something I could do. And maybe that was okay. The next time I saw my sister, it was as if the warmth and familiarity between us had been stripped away, replaced by a tension so thick it felt almost tangible. She hadn't reached out since our last conversation, and I hadn't either, hoping some time apart would soften her feelings. But when she showed up unexpectedly at my apartment one evening, I could see that she wasn't there to make peace. She looked around my apartment as if seeing it for the first time. Her eyes landing on my desk setup, the carefully arranged books, and the general order of the space. "So this is what you need to protect," she said, bitterness lacing her words. It wasn't a question, more of an accusation. She wanted me to feel the weight of her disapproval, to understand that, in her eyes, I was choosing this quiet, organized life over her and her unborn child. I tried to explain again, gently but firmly, that it wasn't about not wanting her here, but about the toll it would take on my work and my mental stability. I told her how much I valued the life I'd worked so hard to build, the peace that came from having a space dedicated to my work and well-being. I tried to help her see that my decision wasn't a rejection of her or the baby, but rather a necessary choice to protect what I had created for myself. But she wasn't having it. Her frustration came pouring out. All the anger and disappointment she'd been holding in since I'd first said no. She accused me of putting myself on a pedestal, acting as if my life was somehow more valuable than hers. She reminded me of all the ways I'd been there for her in the past. How I'd always shown up when she needed me, until now. When she needed me the most. She painted me as someone who had turned his back on family. Someone who was willing to let her struggle alone for the sake of a quiet apartment and a job. I listened, letting her vent, feeling the weight of her words as each one hit harder than the last. Her voice broke as she accused me of abandoning her, saying she'd always looked up to me as her rock, someone she could trust no matter what. Hearing her like that, seeing her pain, I felt my resolve waver. I wanted to reach out, to offer her something that might ease the hurt. But deep down, I knew that giving in out of guilt wouldn't truly help either of us. I would be taking her in without feeling fully committed, and that resentment would only build over time. In a last effort to find some middle ground, I offered to help her financially, to contribute toward her finding a small place nearby or to cover some of her immediate expenses. I told her I could be there for her emotionally, support her through the pregnancy in ways that didn't require living together. But she rejected the offer, insisting that what she needed was family, not financial assistance, not phone calls, but physical presence and support. To her, my offers were band-aids on a wound she felt only I could heal by letting her move in. The conversation ended in frustration, and she left, her anger still simmering. Watching her walk away, I felt a mix of guilt and sadness. Knowing that our relationship might be forever altered by this choice, I couldn't ignore the pain I'd caused her. But I also knew that letting her move in would have been a decision I'd make out of pressure. Not true willingness. It felt like an impossible situation. One where any choice would leave someone hurt, including myself. As the door closed behind her, I sat alone in the silence of my apartment. The very peace I'd fought so hard to keep now tinged with a heaviness I hadn't anticipated. My sister's words echoed in my mind, and for the first time, I questioned if I'd made the right choice in holding my ground. But as conflicted as I felt, I couldn't shake the feeling that this boundary was necessary. I only hoped that, in time, my sister might understand that my decision wasn't about rejecting her, but about preserving the life I'd worked so hard to build. Whether she would forgive me, I didn't know, but for now, all I could do was stand by my choice and face the reality of what it meant for our relationship. Not long after my sister's visit, the phone calls from my parents started. They'd heard her side of the story, and they weren't holding back in making their disappointment known. My mother was especially upset. Echoing my sister's accusations, she questioned how I could turn my back on my own flesh and blood. She reminded me of all the times she and my father had sacrificed for us, recounting the long hours they worked and the comforts they gave up to ensure we never went without. To her, it was inconceivable that I couldn't make a temporary sacrifice for my sister. Hearing my mother's words hurt. It's one thing to wrestle with my own guilt, but having her add to it struck a deeper chord. I'd always respected my parents' sacrifices and how they raised us to value family above all else. Growing up, loyalty wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Our family wasn't perfect, but we were raised with the idea that, no matter what, we would show up for each other. My mother's disappointment made me feel like I was breaking some fundamental promise. Like I was shattering a tradition that was woven into who we were as a family. My father's reaction was less emotional but no less pointed. He told me he understood that I had my own life, but he couldn't understand why I couldn't make room for her in it. Even temporarily. He mentioned how he'd taken in his own younger brother once during a rough patch. Even though it put a strain on his own young marriage. Family doesn't keep score, he said, with a tone that felt more like a judgment than advice. To him, my choice represented a prioritization of self over family, a sign that I'd lost sight of what truly mattered. After those calls, I felt like an outsider to my own family. My boundaries, which had felt so essential, now seemed to them like barriers that kept me separate from them. Proof that I'd put my own needs above the collective good. I couldn't help but wonder if they were right. Had I grown so attached to my independence that I'd lost touch with the values they'd instilled in me? Was my self-preservation just another way of excusing selfishness? I spent a lot of time reflecting on what family loyalty meant to me. My parents saw it as unconditional, no matter the circumstances. You show up for family without question. But as much as I admired that ideal, I questioned whether it could realistically apply to every situation. Loyalty, to me, didn't have to mean sacrificing one's own well-being indefinitely. I felt that it was possible to support family without completely losing myself in the process. Yet my parents' disappointment made me wonder if my idea of loyalty was simply an excuse to keep my life untouched. An attempt to have it both ways. The weight of my family's expectations felt like an enormous pressure, pushing me to be someone I wasn't sure I could be. I'd spent years working toward a life that brought me peace. A life where I felt secure and in control. Did loyalty mean dismantling that life whenever family was in need? And if so, was there any room for my own well-being in the equation? In quieter moments, I reminded myself that my boundary didn't mean I loved my sister any less or didn't care about my family's values. It simply meant that I was prioritizing a version of loyalty that didn't come at the complete expense of my own mental and emotional health. I wanted to believe that loyalty could coexist with self-respect. That I could love my family without constantly having to prove it through sacrifice. But I knew that my family might never see it that way. To them, I would always be the one who said no when my sister needed me most. That choice, to them, would be the moment I failed the family's standard of loyalty. The realization was painful, knowing that this decision might forever alter how they saw me, and possibly even how I saw myself. Ultimately, I was left grappling with two versions of loyalty. The one I'd grown up with, which demanded selflessness at all costs, and the one I was learning to define for myself, where loyalty included honoring my own boundaries. Whether my family would ever understand my perspective, I didn't know, but I knew I had to come to terms with it on my own. If this choice meant drawing a line in the sand, I had to make peace with standing on my side of it, even if it meant facing their disapproval indefinitely. In the weeks that followed, life felt quieter, but heavier. The decision still weighed on me, and the distance from my family felt like an ache I couldn't quite shake. My sister hadn't reached out, and my parents' calls had become less frequent, their disappointment hanging between us in the silence. I knew that my choice had carved out a rift, a reminder that I'd put my own needs above my family's, and it was something they weren't likely to forget. And as much as I wanted to, I couldn't pretend it didn't bother me. Family had always been a part of my identity, and now it felt like I was standing on the edge of it, watching them from a distance. But as the days passed, I also began to see the other side of that decision. I felt a sense of clarity, a quiet relief that I hadn't anticipated. The weight of constant questioning and guilt started to lift, and I found myself reclaiming the peace I had fought to protect. My apartment, my work, and my routines gradually felt like mine again. I realized that, while the decision had been agonizing, it had been necessary to preserve the life I'd built and to stay true to my own boundaries. In the solitude of those reflective days, I came to understand something about family loyalty that I hadn't before. Loyalty didn't have to mean surrendering every part of myself whenever someone asked. It could also mean showing up in ways that were sustainable for me. Loving my family didn't have to mean losing myself in the process. It was about finding a way to offer support without sacrificing my own well-being. And in time, I knew I'd find ways to be there for my sister that didn't compromise the life I had worked so hard to build. While my relationship with my sister felt irreparably altered, I held on to hope that one day, she might come to see my perspective. Maybe she'd realize that my decision wasn't about abandoning her but about holding on to something I needed. Something I couldn't give up without losing a part of myself. For now, though, I had to accept that her understanding might never come. And I had to be okay with that. The boundaries I'd set weren't meant to shut her out, but to keep a part of me whole, a part that had taken years to build and wasn't easily replaceable. As for my parents, I knew that they'd always see my choice through the lens of their own sacrifices. And I understood that their love had always been one of total selflessness, a model they hoped my sister and I would follow. But I had to accept that my version of loyalty looked different and that I couldn't shape my life around what they expected without losing what I valued most. In time, I hoped they'd come to see that my choice wasn't a rejection of our family values but an evolution of them. A way of honoring both my family and myself. In the end, I was left with a deeper understanding of boundaries and the strength it took to hold them. Especially when they went against family expectations. It hadn't been an easy choice. And it came at a cost that I still felt every day. But I realized that the life I had worked so hard to create, the stability, the independence, and the peace, was something worth protecting. And so, I moved forward, knowing that I'd drawn a line not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. The road ahead wasn't perfect, and the distance between my family and me was a wound that might never fully heal. But for the first time, I felt a sense of calm, a reassurance that I could navigate my life on my own terms while still loving my family from a distance. Even if they couldn't fully understand the choices I'd made. If they could one day come to see that my boundaries weren't walls to keep them out, but rather the foundations of a life I could share with them in a healthy way, then maybe we could find a way forward together. But even if that understanding never came, I knew I had chosen a path that felt true to me. And in a way, that realization brought me the peace I'd been searching for all along.